Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're lucky enough to be joined from people all over the world, so I can't even say good afternoon where it is here in the UK, because we have Professor Gab, for whom it is 1 o'clock in the morning. So thank you, everyone, for attending today. We really appreciate it, because we've just launched our major injury set, and this is a good opportunity for us to discuss how we came to develop it, and also to talk through the next plans, the next phase, which is implementation. Next slide, please. I'm Grace Jennings. I'm the Senior Director of the Outcomes Research Team, which is the team that develops sets, and I'll be moderating today. Next slide, please. Just to tell you a little bit about ICHOM in general, we have these sets that we develop, and one of the things we do is we help sites to use them. And once they've put these sets into practice, we have an accreditation program where we look at the data and then we assess it to make sure that people are using the sets in the way that they're intended. And you could get involved in this process through our accreditation program. You can see there's a QR code. We currently have 14 sites accredited at level 1, and we'll shortly be having our first level 2 accreditations. Next slide, please. Here are some of the sites who've already put our sets into practice and who have achieved level 1 accreditation. Next slide, please. The other way you can get involved is through our conference. So our next conference will be almost exactly at this time next year, and in Montreal. So I'm Canadian, so I'm very excited by this. We would love to have your submissions for content. We are accepting them up until February 13th. So it would be great if you could either join us, or if you're working on something exciting to do with VBHC, we'd love to hear from you and see whether you could register your interest as being a panelist, presenting a session, or submitting an abstract. Sorry, next slide, please. So please apply here. Like I say, the deadline will be the 13th of February. So go ahead. And then I'm lucky enough to introduce our speakers today. So we all worked on the set. So Professor Belinda Gab is from Monash University, and she was the chair for our set. Colonel Henk van der Wal is our research fellow, so he did a lot of the background research on understanding the outcomes of interest. And Amanga de Silva is our internal project manager who ran the whole show. And they'll be walking you through the set, the development process, and where we got to. Next slide, please. Just as a little bit of background, the way that ICHOM sets work is that they are sets of patient-centered outcome measures. And we've designed them this way because we feel that what's really important to delivering value, both for patients and for healthcare systems, is to measure what really matters to patients. And we do this by a really rigorous method, which we'll go through in some detail, involving a working group through understanding the domains of interest, the sort of concepts that are of particular importance to patients, and then assigning specific instruments to them. And we use these both in terms of improving clinical practice, so for individual patients, as well as improving overall clinical practice, benchmarking, and ideally transitioning away from a fee-for-service model towards a payment by outputs model. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Next slide, please. And just to give you sort of an idea of what goes into our sets, we have 47 sets currently published. So MJI was our 47th set. We're currently working on bladder cancer, spinal muscular atrophy, kidney stones, and liver disease. Kidney stones should be published pretty close into the new year. So that will be the next set that we publish. And we've been lucky enough to publish, I think it's somewhere like 35 or 36 of our sets in prestigious journals, including this set, which is available in the Lancet, if you're interested. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea of what the sets include, we have different components that the working group goes through and defines. So we define case mix variables, also known as risk adjustment variables or baseline characteristics. And these are the factors that affect the outcomes, but aren't controlled as part of the outcomes. So these are in order to understand who you're looking at. And these are really important to measure so you have an understanding of how to compare people fairly across different sites and across different regions. Then for our outcome measures, we identify the sort of concepts that are really important for patients. So those might look like adverse events, complications, quality of life, psychological well-being, mortality, pain, that kind of sort of conceptual outcome measure. Then we consider where those data will come from, whether they're from the clinician, whether they're directly from the patient. And we identify validated measurement tools. So these can either be clinically reported outcomes, CROMs, or they can be patient-reported outcomes, PROMs. So here we've listed EORTC QOQ-C30, which is a cancer outcome, PROMIS Global 10, which is a generic instrument of health-related quality of life. And finally, the working group will specify the time points for data collection, and these are identified to be as pragmatic as possible within this global context for our working groups, because these aren't designed to be treatment specific. In fact, they're treatment agnostic. They are all about the condition of interest. They don't rely on the clinical pathway that the patients go through. Now I'm going to hand over to Umanga to talk through how the set works. And thanks so much for coming today, and I look forward to your questions later.
Thanks, Grace. So there are a couple key framing principles that we follow to develop sets to meet our goal of comprehensive view of measurement, and that's balanced with something that's actually feasible and can be reliably implemented globally. So firstly, we look at, and something most important is that patients are directly involved in every step of this process. So all the way from the beginning to the end in defining this, and that really helps us ensure that the end result of this work is truly patient-centric, which is core to ICHOM's mission. The outcomes are also defined around medical conditions rather than specialties or procedures, meaning that the sets are treatment agnostic, as Grace has just covered. The patient-reported outcomes and the measures are also included in all of our sets to capture things like symptom burden, functioning, and quality of life, in addition to clinically reported outcomes, which also should cover outcomes that are still patient important. And then, as Grace mentioned, we capture case mix variables for risk adjustment and stratification purposes, and that allows for meaningful comparisons of outcomes and also helps bring attention to potential disparities by capturing factors such as things related to social determinants of health. And finally, the sets are developed by global and inclusive multidisciplinary teams through a very rigorous Delphi consent process, which has been tested, as Grace has mentioned, across 47 sets and counting. So we'll start to get into the development of the MJI set, but first we just wanted to take a second to acknowledge our sponsors for this work. And this set was made possible by the Transport Accident Commission in Australia, SVZK in the Netherlands, and the AO Foundation. And just a quick note to mention here as well that we're incredibly grateful for all their support. And the sponsors did remain kind of outside of the working group, so this work was very much independently developed by the expert working group that we empaneled. So I'll hand over from here to Linda to go over the rationale for the major injury sets.
Thanks, Humanga, and thanks, Grace, for the introduction. I am Belinda Gabbay. I am a professor from Monash University in Melbourne. I am a researcher with a background in physiotherapy, and pretty much all of my research is in the injury and trauma space. This ICHOM major injury set had a pretty strong rationale for why it was actually developed. Injury is one of the biggest contributors to the global burden of disease. It accounts for about 10% of the global burden of disease, and there's a growing interest in understanding what the long-term impacts of injury actually are, or trauma actually are. And while we've made some real progress in establishing kind of frameworks for the types of impacts that injury can actually have on people's lives and on their carers and close others, we haven't actually really fully been able to measure the impact of those injuries in a really standardized way or across populations. There's been a growing interest in understanding survivorship rather than just survival. So for a very, very long time, we largely measured the success or the impact of trauma care on whether patients lived from their injuries, but that is no longer sort of seen as the standard anymore. There's been a huge shift towards survivorship and the quality of survival of people who've experienced trauma. And so that's created a really significant groundswell across the world in understanding non-fatal injury burden, including things like health-related quality of life, function, disability, and the like. Um, it's a tricky area, there's no question about it. Injury is really diverse. I mean, everybody in their life, they consider injury is really considered part of the human condition. Everybody experiences injury in their life, whether to a greater or lesser extent. But certainly everybody's life is touched by injury. The types of injuries that can happen are really diverse. They can be very, relatively, what people would consider minor. So things like spraining your ankle while playing sport to having quite severe injuries like experiencing a spinal cord injury or a traumatic brain injury. They can be very complex. One of the interesting things about injury is that often people don't sustain just one injury. They can actually have multiple injury or polytrauma. And they can be very high cost for management, quite complicated in the management, involve multiple specialties, and there are, and across all ages. So it is really actually quite a challenging area for measuring injury outcomes. And if we are going to better understand the care that's provided and the quality of care that's provided, and really look at value-based healthcare, we do need to be able to benchmark outcomes across settings, across health services, and the like. I think it's been well established that a need for a standardized global injury set has been well overdue. There have been some fantastic initiatives that have been done in particular countries, but certainly not anything that have been done at a global level. So if we don't all agree on how we measure outcomes and what are the most important outcomes, and we don't do that from both the perception of researchers and clinicians and people with lived experience, we're probably not actually measuring the outcomes that are the most relevant. And really, we are really looking for measures that are relevant across the whole of the world, and that in itself is quite a challenging aspect as well. So really, that's sort of been the rationale for the major injury set. There's a global groundswell towards looking at survivorship or the quality of survival of people who've experienced trauma. We need to address this so that we can actually really implement value-based healthcare. And to do that, we really need this standardized set to actually help us. If we're all measuring the same things, then it puts us in a level playing field for implementing value-based healthcare and also benchmarking care across the globe. So that's really our rationale for why we did this and why our sponsors, our funders came on board as well. I had the distinct pleasure, it was an absolute pleasure and a privilege to chair the working group. It was an incredible working group. It involved people from 11 countries. It included researchers, it included clinicians and clinicians from a wide variety of specialties, and also people with lived experiences and either as a patient themselves or as a carer for a person who'd experienced major injury. And I know that I can see on the list that there's quite a few from the working group that have joined the webinar tonight. So I really just want to extend a huge thank you for all of their work. It was a really, really great project to be involved in. And I think I think it's handing over to Hank now, isn't it, Yumanga?
In
Manga.
just a second
Oh,
before
back to
we
you.
do
Yeah,
so,
sorry.
thanks,
Yeah.
Linda. I just wanted to very quickly touch on our timeline for this project to ground some of the discussion for this webinar and some of the key stages and components that we'll be discussing. So this set development process began in May of 2024 and concluded of this year. So it spans just under a year. And developed over 8 working group meetings where we discussed the outcomes for this minimum global recommendation, the associated measures for data collection, the case mix variables, and those time points for measurement. And these discussions were supplemented by reviews of the trauma literature as well. And towards the end of the process, we also developed what we call a primary subset, which is a very minimal version of the set for providers to use as a starting point for implementation. And we'll cover that towards the end of this webinar as well. And following each of those 8 working group meetings, we also sent the working group members brief surveys for them to provide their voting decisions for the discussion points that we covered in our meetings so that we could reach consensus on what to include in this recommendation. So in addition to those working group calls, we also held separate meetings with the working group members with lived experience in our group, and that was done at several touch points. And this was really to ensure that we got their feedback on whether the step was in the right direction and reflected the correct patient priorities. And this feedback was then reflected back to the wider working group to facilitate their decision making. Another really key aspect of this process that we'll cover today is the open review period we held during the second half of this process. And that was really to seek feedback from global trauma experts, both patients and professionals, through 2 surveys that were disseminated to determine their level of agreement with the recommendation was launched broadly. And that was to ensure that we could fine-tune the recommendation as needed before it was launched. But from here, I will hand off to Henk to get to the first part of the set and recommendation, which was to define our scope and the outcome searches.
Thank you, Manga. Hello, everyone. I'm Henk van der Wal. I have been the research fellow for this project, and that was also as part of my PhD project on the applicability look for value-based healthcare in military health systems. So that was really nice in-depth research project being part of this project. So what I will do is I will take you through some steps of the whole project, starting with the scope. As you can see in the screen, the first in the preparation for the scope, and I will in the next slide will show you the scope in a minute. So we first look at what is the patient population where we would focus on in the discussion. We looked at everybody from children to elderly, and actually we decided to focus on adults, and I will come back on that in a moment. The second one was the trauma mechanism. Started, as you can see, physical and psychological, but we also discussed to stay or focused on major injury on the physical side, and of course including also the psychological elements who were originating from the physical injury. On the physical trauma mechanisms, looking at the mechanical, neurological, and burn injury, and on the last column in that part of the slide, you can see blunt penetrating trauma, self-inflicted, also including military, both combat and non-combat injury, and from the neurological TBI and spine cord injury. On the right top side, the trauma severity. In the discussions, again, we look, okay, what should we use? And actually, in the end, we decided to use the injury severity score for the cutoff value for the trauma severity, and then decided on 9 and higher. The last one, trauma approach, the fourth part was starting from the in-hospital care, and I will come back a little bit more on that in the next slide with the definitive scope. Next slide, please. So here you can see the scope decided by the working group. Coming back to the adult on the far right side, patient population. One of the things, the discussions we had was what age is the adult patient? From where are you talking about an adult? So we saw there was a cutoff age is globally, the cutoff age for adults globally really differs. So what we have decided, we use the term adult, but we also have written down in the scope that it's the use of local defined age as a starting point. So in every regional, they can decide they can use their own adult cutoff age. Then the physical, I already discussed that one. So that was really important. So we focus on the physical trauma. ISS score, I already said it was ISS score 9 or higher. Then from the trauma care approach, we said, okay, where should we start in hospital care, and even also discussion on pre-hospital care. We have decided with the working group decided we use in hospital care and the rehabilitation recovery process. So that part of the trauma care. And for pre-hospital care, we included it as a case mix variable. Also, because of it was a very wide variability across much countries. So it was really hard and would make it very complex to include start with pre-hospital care. And then on the exclusion, it was also, we excluded children, partly because there are not very much, but we found prompts and measures also really dedicated for children. And it's more valuable to have our own set for pediatric and adolescent patients. And then I think I will give it back to Manga.
Thanks, Hank. So just to discuss next steps once we had the scope for the set agreed, we then went on to identify the most relevant outcomes for these patient populations. And to do that, we used these three sources. And so the first was to look at which outcomes are captured in trauma registries and any existing consensus efforts to identify what is already used across the world. We also conducted a review of the trauma literature, and we extracted outcomes from large studies and other relevant research efforts. And finally, we also held a breakout call with the people with lived experience in our working group, where we presented the outcomes identified from those initial two sources with the intention to identify any potential gaps in the outcomes and really ensure that all patient-important outcomes would be captured in that final and full list that was presented to the working group for voting to decide on that minimum recommendation. So the vote involved a modified Delphi process consisting of 3 rounds of voting. So we reached consensus through these 3 calls where we discussed the full outcomes and associated Delphi surveys that we were sending out following those calls. First, the working group members were asked to use a 1 to 9 Likert scale to rank the outcomes between 7 to 9. So if they felt a particular outcome was essential to include in a minimum set, they would rank that between 7 to 9. 4 to 6 was used to indicate an outcome was nice to have, but maybe not essential for a minimum set. And a ranking of 1 to 3 was used to indicate that an outcome was not relevant for a minimum set and should be excluded. And in that first round of vote, we required 80% consensus within the group for outcomes to be either included or excluded. And anything that didn't reach either of these thresholds moved into the next round of voting, where we applied the same rules. So in between that first and second Delphi survey, as I mentioned, we had another working group call to discuss those inconclusive outcomes and discuss which ones still remained really essential to include in a minimum set. And so we had a lot of very comprehensive discussions and multiple, stakeholder perspectives as well to ensure that was well-rounded. So once we had those 2 surveys for the Delphi vote using that 1 to 9 Likert scale, we then held our final Delphi survey that consisted of all the inconclusive outcomes that hadn't reached consensus in those initial 2 rounds. And here for that last survey, we used a binary vote, and that consisted of options to either include or exclude any of the remaining inconclusive outcomes. So any outcomes that were voted for required here at least 70% consensus to be taken forward into the final list, just to ensure that anything that was still considered the majority of the group and had gone through several rounds of discussion would still be captured. So Hank, over to you for this.
Thank you. Thank you again. So actually what Umanga already said with the Delphi stages we followed, and there were really thorough discussions on this one. So as you can see, there are a lot of outcomes, and we even have started with an even bigger number of outcomes. So before to talk a little bit about the outcomes, the search strategy results was actually, when we started with it, we had about 91,000 records to start with. And then actually we said, okay, with so many records, as a first result, we said, okay, let's start with random selected batches of relevant articles with batches of 500, and actually until we reached saturation. So in the end, we scanned title and abstract screening for 1,500 records, and that included in the end 126 studies. Within then analyzing these studies, we identified 143 outcomes. And then actually with all the discussions followed this is we included 26 outcomes in the set. And as you can see in the screen, the 26, we choose to split them up in 4 outcome domains: patient-reported health status, functioning and psychological well-being, and mental health. And then also they included 4 clinical reported outcomes in a also subgroup clinical outcomes. From here, we continue to actually start working on the measures, and I will continue to that one too. So next one, please. Next slide. Next one. So here you can see actually the literature search process we followed again for the measures. Started actually looking at relevant prompts and the psychometric studies which we identified by using the Terway filter first, but also did some manual searching, systematic reviews, and from there we start filtering those on elements like the free use, minimum or actually time to fill in the survey, less than 20 minutes, or 40 items, available in 3 or most of the most commonly spoken languages. Then we also did the psychometric properties, evaluated on reliability, validity, sensitivity to change. And actually we used those criteria to select the prompt tools for the major injury set. When that search, when we started, we screened 1,782 articles, identified 299 measures to work with, and in the end we had 29 measures who were most frequently cited, and actually we presented that to the working group for the further discussions. Next slide, please. This actually is given an overview. I don't want to talk a lot about it, but what I already mentioned, we looked at licensing, focusing on licensing, but also on the cost, with focusing really on the free of charge target population. That's the trauma, number of languages I already mentioned, but also like elements like burden, patient burden, administrative burden. And then the next slide, and that resulted in the summary of the outcomes and the measures. As already when we started this webinar, you already saw the circle. This is the circle for the major injury set, and it resulted in up to 6 prompts depending on the type of major injury, focusing on the less burden and also the flexible use. So what I want to address is that we started with a crosswalk of 4 prompts, which really can be used like on per institutional or regional, at country level. You can choose one of those 4 because they cover what they have to cover, what we saw as outcomes and measures. From the crosswalk, we said, okay, that we need a prompt for substance use and one for PTSD. And then we also selected injury-specific prompts, and that was for TBI, spinal cord injury, and for burns, those 3. Then the last 2, which we are included also for the set, was for sleep and for sex. And that's why I said it depends on the type of injury, up to 6 prompts. Quite some discussion we also had in the working group on including a prompt for musculoskeletal injury, and actually on the end it was not voted in, But as you can see, when you see at our article, that we have put in the recommendation to use the MFSA prompts for in case of extra injury on the extremities. And then I will go back to Umanga.
Thank you. So after deciding on the outcomes and measures, we then moved on to the next two components of the set, and these were the case mix variables and the time points for data collection to really facilitate those meaningful comparisons of data. Starting off with the case mix variables, here when we say case mix, as Grace noted earlier in the webinar, we really mean patient attributes, so variables that have an impact on the outcomes of interest. So they can be thought of as confounding factors that need to be taken into account when risk adjusting the data so that you can allow for more meaningful comparisons. So for example, for things like benchmarking efforts. And in ICHOM sets, these typically are related to things such as demographics, baseline health and lifestyle, and also treatment-related factors. So here are some of the considerations the working group members kept in mind when deciding on the case mix variables were whether these were relevant to the outcomes that were included into the set, whether they improved predictive power over included variables, whether the variables were practical to collect, and if the variables were also internationally comparable, which was very important to our work. And so we identified these variables by looking at the literature, but also based on the experiences of our working group members. But I'll hand over back to Henk to share how these case mix variables were identified.
Yeah, so here what you can see, actually, Umanga already mentioned it. We looked at also the suggestions from the working group, good food for thought, which also gave us good discussions on and actually in a valuable way to reach consensus in the end. We also selected, from the right side to the left, selected the ICHOM harmonized case mix variables, actually really choosing a smart use, and also for the benchmarking would be very valuable. It makes also on case mix level, it would be make the benchmarking easier. We screened 110 relevant papers, but actually where we also started with when we started after the search strategy for the outcomes who were identified, we already looked at the case mix variables and time points, which we saw in those studies. And there was not the main task at that moment, because we were still focusing on the outcomes, but we already identified them. So later on, when we came in this phase of the project, we said, okay, then we already had a starting point to select case mix variables and time points. Next slide, please. Then the case mix variables, again, focusing on trying to have a less burden. And then also we divided in three groups: demographic variables, baseline clinical and health status, and treatment variables. I want to mention a few items, especially within the middle group. So the comorbidities was supported by the self-administered comorbidity questionnaire. For what we already mentioned, the injury severity for using the ISS, Glasgow Coma Scale, score for consciousness. Because those were important to include those. And then actually what we also did, we created a case mix variable, intent of injury, who's around in the middle, and actually which one we used, and already what I was mentioning about the combat injury, non-combat injuries, that we said, oh, the intent of injury is focusing on there were three variables: civilian, military combat related, and military non-combat related. Also, and then actually it fits in with my own research there, where we can say, okay, what normally in the military health system, military healthcare, we really focus on clinical reported outcomes, but I think we have to shift to on also in the military for patient reported outcomes too. So this will help, and that's also for future research was okay, are we going to use in our military regular care in non-combat environment? But also now it would be very nice to do some experiments or to see if we can use this set in a combat environment. So that makes it even more usable. And I also like to use that for maybe future benchmarking. Next slide, please. Then time points. We created this overview for the time points. After all the discussions, we created consensus on 3 time points on baseline, 6 months, and 1 year. Of course, there was a good discussion, maybe going on time points for 2 years, for 5 years, depending again on the severity of the injury, on the rehabilitation process for the individual patient. But in the consensus, it is a minimum, and everybody can, of course, every institution or provider can use more time points or different ones, but this is the basic. And actually, what most interesting from this is actually the discussion on baseline. So we had a discussion in the working group. What is baseline? And it was even a challenge. We were even challenged in the peer review process when after submitting the article, they were challenged to make it more clear what is the baseline. So there was, in our discussion, it was like pre-injury, point of injury, in hospital to choose the baseline moment, the time point. And actually, so we decided as the baseline is the acute setting where the major injury patient enters the care pathway. The ideal situation from that position, it would be actually the pre-injury status, because then you can really start with collecting some information you see in the column with the baseline. But because of the unpredictability of the major injury, is that actually we have written down measure as soon as possible after the injury, and that's very important, where the patient is clinical stable and when there's also a safe situation for the patient. So that's really interesting. And when you look at our published article, you can read more about it, how we defined those more in detail. And I think I will give it back to Umanga now again. Thank you.
Thank you, Henk. So once all these components of the set were decided by the working group, so specifically the outcomes, the measures, the case mix, and the time points, we then held an external validation phase, which I mentioned at the start, where we requested survey feedback from trauma experts globally. So that includes both patients and professionals for their input on this recommendation. So start with the validation survey. Here we received ethical approvals or exemptions to disseminate this survey in Australia, the US, the UK, New Zealand, and Ireland, where we asked patients for feedback on these included outcomes in particular. So it was really just focused on the outcomes in this survey. We received 121 responses, and respondents agreed on all but 3 of the outcomes being absolutely essential for inclusion, with it just being substance use, mortality, and just discharge location falling just shy of that 70% threshold for agreement. There was also consensus that no essential outcomes were missing from the minimum recommendation, and there was also broad agreement that the data would help support trauma care, which was fantastic to see. Next, we had the professional survey. Here we asked for feedback on the outcomes, the measures, the case mix, and the time points included in the recommendations. And we had 70 professionals from 16 countries that completed the survey, with the 5 countries where we received the most responses being Australia, New Zealand, the US, the UK, and Germany. And here, agreement was reached on all the outcomes, the measures, reporting as well, in addition to the case mix variables and all the time points that were suggested in this minimum recommendation. So overall, we were very encouraged by these results, and it really helped validate the working group's recommendations that they developed throughout the year to ensure that all the important considerations for the set had really been taken into account during that development process. And the results really ensured that we felt comfortable launching the set. So we also want to briefly touch on the final part of the development process, which was the primary subset. So under here, we've listened to feedback from implementers worldwide who've noted that getting started with implementation of outcome measurement isn't necessarily easy. And despite these sets being minimum recommendations for outcome measurement, it can still be very difficult to get started, and really for partners who are new to implementation. So as part of this set development process now, we now identify these primary subsets to specify which outcomes are essential within the set and shouldn't be missed as to use as a starting point for implementation before implementers can eventually scale up and implement the full set. And here to select the primary subset, the working group selected the essential outcomes on a 1 to 9 Likert scale, where 80% consensus was needed on rankings of 7 to 9, as we did for the Delphi survey earlier in the process. And in addition to the outcomes, all case mix variables are collected as these remain necessary for fair data comparisons based on different patient risk profiles. And as you can see, this has led to a subset that is much more digestible to start with in terms of the outcomes included. But to capture these outcomes, even though it still might look like a lengthier list when you have a look at it, you really only need 3 proms to get started, which is much more easy to access for new implementers who might need advice on where to begin if they aren't able to adopt the full set outright. So following the launch of the set in April, we have now moved into the dissemination and implementation phase. So we're very excited about what's next for this work, but I'll hand over to Belinda to share some more details on what that has involved so far.
Thanks so much, Humanga, and thank you, Hank. It's I think everybody who's on the call today would realize now exactly how much work has gone into developing the major injury set. It's been an extraordinary amount of work and really beautifully coordinated and managed by Humanga and the team at ICHOM. And this has sort of culminated in a publication which is now out in the Lancet eClinical Medicine, and I would encourage people to use the QR code. It's actually open access, and there's quite a lot of detail actually in that paper. And as Henk has talked about, we talk about the pros and cons of what we did, the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the set, and the plans for moving forward, which we'll discuss in the next slide. So we have this set now. It's published. All of the materials required to understand the set, to know what the instruments are, to know how to implement it are really all available from the ICHOM website. But really, this is the time now. This is really our call to action to look to roll the set out in as many places around the world as we possibly can to test it and to provide feedback as well. So there's an implementation directory. If you are looking to implement the set, we would encourage you to register on that directory so that we can essentially develop a community of practice around the world around using the set. We can share each other's experiences and refine the set as we move forward in time. But really, we're looking to see the set rolled out in clinical care, so in health services around the world, to be used as a research basis. So particularly where there are studies looking at longitudinal or longer term outcomes of people who've experienced injury. And also to understand the global applicability. If you read our paper in the Lancet eClinical Medicine, you'll understand that we really tried to go for global representation on the injury working group, but we do have some gaps. And so there are some voices that perhaps weren't heard in the process. And now is the time to test that through the implementation of the set worldwide and the testing. And the only way that we will make sure that this set really is fully applicable across the world and takes into account equity is by rolling it out. And through this process, it's really about getting the evidence in what the outcomes are across the world, that we're looking at equity and understanding the time course for recovery after major injury. So this is really our call to action, and hopefully many of the people on the call are in a situation where they could be looking to implement the set, and we really encourage you to register that, get a hold of the materials, register it, and form part of that worldwide initiative and that global community of practice on major injury outcomes. And really, I think on the last slide, so I run trauma registries in Victoria in Australia. We have been following up our patients at 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years after injury for the best part of 2 decades. And we're looking to many of the elements of the set are already included in our follow-up, but there are new instruments that we've never tried before. So with the support of the Transport Accident Commission, we'll be looking to do a pilot of the ICHOM set in Victoria in 2026. And we'll be looking to implement it probably over a 3-month period, which would be somewhere in the order of about 3,000 patients that would be included in that pilot of the set. So there'll be some really nice data that will come out of that, will help us understand how the set works and how Australian patients actually accept the instruments that are in the ICHOM set. And it's a good start from our perspective. So we're really excited about that pilot study. And Henk, you've got some plans as well. You're on mute.
So I'm back again. No. So yeah, actually, it's there's only one word: NATO. What we are going to do from the Center for Expertise, which I'm leading, is that we are going to start an experiment during the largest military medical exercise in NATO. That's a biannual exercise. This year, next year in Estonia. And what we are going to do is looking at the feasibility and desirability of the use of the major injury set in military field hospitals. So it's under operational conditions. What we are going to, so it's actually not a clinical experiment, because it's like, we are going to work with real care providers, but also with exercise patients. But we are going to focus on using the major injury set in the size as we has it now. Is it usable in like a high speed evacuation of military patients? So that will be where we have to deal with. So we are looking at time constraints. How much time do we have to find or get to survey patients, military patients? We're looking at things like burden for both the patient, but also for the care providers. And is the surveyor, is it like, is he interfering with the evacuation process too much or not? And in the end, of course, receiving really hands-on feedback where we can use like, okay, we can use the set, or we maybe have to like even minimize the set to get some really basic information, all kinds of things. So that is really in the phase of an experiment. So I'm looking forward, and hopefully and that will be in May next year. So hopefully later there we can present the results for that one. Thank you.
Thank you both. So as has been mentioned just now, there's some exciting pilots that are in the works, and we're really encouraged by the interest that the set has received as well. It has been disseminated through different conferences, for example, and so expect that slowly we'll start to learn more of other pilots or other implementation efforts using the MJI set. So here, Belinda also mentioned our ICHOM implementation directory. So we wanted to briefly touch on that in case you would be interested in learning more about that. But essentially, this is a map on our website that has, at the moment, 563 globally implementing sites and counting. So who are using one or more of our sets globally. And so we encourage you to join this map and let us know if you are implementing another ICHOM set, or maybe if you start to use the major injury set as well. You can complete a brief survey on our website to let us know where you are in this process. And you can be added to this survey so that others who are accessing it can learn more about the work that you're doing. And likewise, you can use this as a resource to learn more about the work that's been done globally, patient-centered outcome measurement and value-based healthcare. So please do follow the QR code on the slide to learn more about that. So if you're interested in taking a closer look at the details of the set in particular, you can find all of the resources freely available on our website through a brief summary flyer. That's essentially a 2-page overview of the outcomes and the measures that are included, as well as the details of the working group. We also have a full major injury set available as a reference guide. And this is a very detailed document on how to capture the entire recommendation we summarized today. So all the data, the information you would need on every single variable for the outcomes, the measures, the time points for measurement, as well as the case mix variables, as well as what is encompassed by the primary subset. We encourage you to find that on our website and use that resource if you're interested in learning more. And as has been mentioned, we also have our peer-reviewed publication that was recently published just a few weeks ago in November. So that provides more details of the set development process that we've touched on today, as well as all the decisions that were discussed. So we encourage you to give that a read as well. And we're, of course, happy to answer any questions offline if there's anything we can clarify. Finally, thinking in terms of implementation, we have digital versions of all of our sets available, and these contain SNOMED and LOINC codes, and that will really enable semantic interoperability, the included variables, and also can help a lot of reduce a lot of that implementation burden. So if you would like to access these digital sets, then please do feel free to reach out to us for more information on how you can find that. So just to close off, the ICHOM sets are also now part of the criteria for Newsweek and Statista's World's Best Hospital rankings. And essentially these show what constitutes a best hospital, and it shows that this criteria is defined patient-centered and equitable care, which can actually be very much facilitated by the use of ICHOM sets. So we're incredibly excited that this resource is available now to trauma patients and professionals, and we are very much looking forward to seeing this used in practice to advance trauma care for patients globally. So thank you all so much for your attention. And from here, I'll hand back over to Grace as we get to the Q&A for this webinar. And again, please do feel free to leave any questions that you might have in the Zoom function, and we'll get that in a second.
Thanks so much, Umanga, Belinda, and Hunk. I think it's been such a great opportunity, and I gather there have been a few issues with the QR code. So there is the QR code here, but I believe one of my colleagues has also dropped the URL into the chat in case you need to look at it that way. So we've had a few questions come in already, so please do use the Q&A function. And the first question is, how can someone become involved in a working group? So I can give the sort of top line answer, which is that it will depend on what set's available at the time. Right now, we're recruiting for bladder cancer. So if you're interested, particularly if you're a patient, please get in touch with us and we'd be happy to talk to you. Umanga, do you have any other insights on how you become part of a working group?
We have a newsletter that goes out monthly, so you're very much welcome to sign up to our newsletter to stay updated on which sets are available, and we always provide information on how you can get involved. So please feel free to take a look at that. And we're very excited to work with anyone who is interested in, participating in our sets. So please always feel free to get in touch. And if there's a new set that you feel we haven't developed yet, but there's opportunity to do so, then we're welcome to learn from you as well, where there may be opportunities. So feel free to get in touch for those reasons as well.
And the next question is, can we have the slides and recordings? I believe the recordings will be shared directly after this webinar when they're available. And if you'd like the slides, please feel free to share your email address with us, and we will get them to you. So then for more substantive issues, first of all, is there any cost associated with accessing the measurement set? No. ICHOM makes all ICHOM sets free to access, but the instruments are held by separate people who license them out, which means that there may be an access cost associated with that. We try our best to make sure that that is minimized as much as possible. We choose lower cost or free instruments wherever we can, but sometimes some of our sets do have instruments that are associated with the cost. Belinda.
Yeah, so most of the instruments that we do have chosen are free. Oh no, actually, I don't have my hand up. I don't know why I have my hand up. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Apologies to everyone. It's 2 o'clock in the morning here, so it's been a very long day. So yeah, I don't know why my hand is up.
That's absolutely fine. Well, I do have some more substantive questions for you, Belinda, so I wouldn't worry too much.
Yeah.
So the first one is the set currently available in Arabic, or is it only in English and therefore requires translation and localization for use in the Saudi context? And again, the set itself is available in English. The instruments themselves, however, would require to be translated and localized. Now, there are some sets that are already translated. And as far as I understand, it's very important not to retranslate a set that's already been translated. But the best way to make sure you get the most up-to-date versions is to contact the actual instrument developers themselves. Umanga, do you have any other insights into that?
Yeah, I would just note that a lot of the proms we've included are quite widely used, and actually a lot of them do have translations in Arabic. So hopefully there won't be too many barriers. But if you are interested in having a prom that's been included in the set translated into other languages, then please also feel free to reach out to us, because there are several services that we have worked with previously that are able to support these translation and validation efforts. So we would be happy to put you in touch if you'd be wanting to learn more.
And then I think this one's more for Belinda and maybe Henk as well. Given that many trauma survivors live with long-term functional limitations, how has accessibility been considered in the design of the patient-reported outcome measures? Specifically, is the set disability accessible for individuals with cognitive, motor, or communication challenges that often follow major traumatic injuries?
Yeah, it's a great question. In many of the circumstances, the instruments that have been chosen have the capability to be delivered to a close other. For example, if there are physical or cognitive issues that actually prevent the person who's experienced injury completing, there is the capability for a family member or close other to actually complete on their behalf. And most of the instruments have that capacity built into them. My understanding too, Yamanga, is that ICHOM have made them very digitally accessible as well. So there are multiple modes of administration too to help with that. So yeah, Henk, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe on the already on the last one on the military veterans, or shall I just address that one? Because and I can share it, but I don't have it now standing. A colleague of me published a 10-year follow-up study on veterans who were with traumatic injuries. So that's really, so actually the answer would be you can apply our set, because in that study they already used a few of the problems we had also added in our set.
I have. So then the final question that we've received so far is, can this set be applied to military veterans who have older or long-standing traumatic injuries? For example, is it validated or appropriate for use amongst veterans with chronic trauma-related conditions? So Henk, really looking at you.
So yeah. So actually, I was answering on that one. It's yes, and I mentioned the example. And Faisal, if I can get your email address, I can even send you a copy or the link from the study I mentioned.
Yeah, and I think as Henk mentioned, we've chosen, but the working group through the Delphi process chose baseline 6 months and 1 year, but with the full recognition that there are people that will take a lot longer than that to recover, or may go on to have sort of longer term implications. So there's no question that if you wanted to add additional time points or follow up further down the track, there is no question that the set should be appropriate for that. But as we've talked about through the implementation, the testing and validation in various settings and contexts, it will be we will gather, even more information around the validity of the set in those settings.
All right. That's the end of the questions that we have showing up in our Q&A, but I just want to give everybody one more second in case they think of something, because there's nothing worse than thinking of that question just as you're leaving. So I have a question, Belinda. You say you're starting a pilot. What's that going to look like? How are you integrating the new proms and other instruments into what you're already doing?
So at the moment, we've actually been doing the costing work for how much that will change our follow-up at the moment. So there are instruments that we already use, like the EQ5D5L. We already use some of the other measures we already use as well. But it's really about what the additional time it will take and how we'll implement that into. We also have an online version for our patients and family members to complete. So how we're just going through the process of putting together, making the changes so that we can actually roll that out. And we'll be delivering it we have an orthopedic trauma outcomes registry, which is people who've been admitted to hospital for more than 24 hours with orthopedic trauma. And we also have a major trauma registry, which would be, in that one, it's really ISS greater than 12. So it's two different patient populations. A lot of our orthopedic trauma patients will meet the ISS greater than 9 threshold as well. And we, as I said, routinely follow those patients up at 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. So it would be making the change to collecting our instruments that we always collect, but also adding on the additional ones that are in the ICHOM set. So we expect it'll probably be in the thousands of patients that we'd be looking at for that pilot if we do it for a few months. So, yeah.
Oh, so I've had another question. Do most of your patients complete the proms using the online platform? How do you ensure a decent response rate?
That's a really fantastic question. We have really great follow-up rates at 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. A little bit of a drop at 2 years to around 70-75%. But we technically usually get about 80 to 85% of patients at 6 months and 1 year after injury. And we give patients the option to complete online or to do a telephone interview. We're in the fortunate position that we can do that. And we've actually published some work on this about people who choose online over telephone. And so there are certain subgroups of the injury population who prefer to do it by telephone. And there are groups that actually prefer to do it online. We find around half of our orthopedic trauma patients choose online and about half choose telephone. And it's probably similar for our major trauma patients, but we actually find we also did some work with burns patients, and people with burns actually much preferred telephone. So we give them the option.
Great. I think that is actually now the end of the questions. So I just really wanted to say a huge thank you to Belinda and Hank, not only for today, which has been fantastic, but also for all the work you've put in over the last couple of years on the set. We really, really couldn't have done it without you. And finally, I truly want to thank Yamanga, who has driven the set with extreme dedication and persistence and has been an absolutely wonderful asset to ICHOM overall. So thank you so much, all three, for your help in bringing this set to life. And please do send us any further questions or if you want any of the materials that we've mentioned today. And have a lovely holiday season. Thank you. Bye.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.